Be careful with this menopause thing, so my son doesn't want to get another one. Those were the exact words my father-in-law whispered to my husband at our family barbecue last month, thinking I couldn't hear them from the kitchen. I'm 52, married for 23 years, and apparently I'm now disposable goods because my body is going through natural changes. But here's the thing about underestimating a woman who's past her prime. We have nothing left to lose, and we're really good at digging up buried secrets. What my father-in-law didn't know is that his cruel comment would lead me down a rabbit hole that would expose the darkest chapter of his past. A chapter involving his first wife, my husband's mother, who died when my husband was only 12. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. You see, for 23 years, I've been the perfect daughter-in-law. I've organized every family gathering, remembered every birthday, and swallowed every passive-aggressive comment with a smile. I've been grateful, accommodating, and invisible when convenient. But that comment about my menopause being a problem that might make my husband want another one, that was the final straw. Because what I discovered about what really happened to his first wife will make your blood boil. And the way I used that information to serve him the coldest dish of justice? Well, let's just say karma has a very long memory. Let me paint you a picture of my life before everything unraveled. I'm Sarah, 52 years old, and I work as a librarian at our local university. I know. The stereotype writes itself. Quiet, bookish woman who probably reads romance novels and has too many cats. Well, you're half right about the books, but I'm allergic to cats, and my love story was supposed to be the real deal. I met my husband David when I was 29. He was this gentle, soft-spoken man who worked as an accountant and had this tragic backstory that made every maternal instinct in me want to protect him. His mother had died when he was 12, and his father, Robert, had raised him as a single dad. David would get this distant look in his eyes whenever he talked about his mother, saying he barely remembered her because the grief was too much for a child to process. Robert seemed like the perfect father-in-law at first. He was this distinguished 75-year-old retired businessman who owned several rental properties around town. Always impeccably dressed, always had stories about his glory days, and always made sure everyone knew he was the patriarch of the family. He had this way of making you feel like you should be grateful for his approval. Our wedding was beautiful, and Robert walked me down the aisle since my own father had passed away 2 years earlier. I remember feeling so lucky to be gaining not just a husband, but a father figure who seemed to genuinely care about me. He would call me his daughter and brag to his friends about how I was the best thing that ever happened to David. For over 2 decades, I played the role perfectly. I hosted every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday party. I sent Robert Father's Day cards, bought him thoughtful gifts, and listened to his endless stories about his business successes. When he had his knee surgery 3 years ago, I was the one who drove him to physical therapy twice a week for 4 months. David and I never had children. We tried for years, went through fertility treatments, the whole heartbreaking journey. Robert was surprisingly supportive during that time, always saying things like, "You two have each other and that's what matters." I thought he was being genuinely kind. Our marriage was solid, or so I thought. David was attentive. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our quiet Sunday mornings reading the paper together. We weren't passionate anymore, but we were comfortable, and I thought that was enough. We had our struggles. What couple doesn't after 23 years? But nothing that felt insurmountable. I started going through peri-menopause about 2 years ago. Hot flashes, mood swings, the whole package. David was patient at first, bringing me ice packs during night sweats and not complaining when I'd wake up cranky. But I noticed him becoming more distant lately, spending more time at his father's house, coming home later from work. I attributed it to stress. His job at the accounting firm had been demanding, and Robert had been having some health issues that required more attention. I was dealing with my own changes, the menopause symptoms, feeling invisible at work as younger librarians got promoted, watching my body change in ways that made me feel like a stranger to myself. The irony is that I was actually starting to feel more confident in some ways. Menopause, for all its challenges, had given me this strange sense of freedom. I was sleeping better when the hot flashes weren't waking me up. I felt less anxious about pleasing everyone, and I'd started speaking up more at work. I was becoming the woman I wish I'd been in my 30s. But apparently, this new version of me, the one who was finding her voice and caring less about being nice all the time, was threatening to the men in my family. And that comment at the barbecue was about to show me just how expendable they thought I was. But everything started to change when I began paying closer attention to the family dynamics I'd been blind to for over 2 decades. It started with small things. Robert would make these little comments about my appearance. "Sarah's looking tired lately," or "Maybe you should suggest she try that new salon downtown, David." Comments that seemed caring on the surface, but always left me feeling diminished. When I started experiencing hot flashes, he'd dramatically fan himself and joke about women of a certain age whenever I'd adjust the thermostat. David, instead of defending me, would just laugh uncomfortably and change the subject. I told myself he was just avoiding conflict, that he didn't want to upset his father. After all, Robert was getting older, and David felt responsible for him since he was an only child. Then came the more direct comments. During a family dinner 3 months ago, Robert mentioned his neighbor's divorce. "Poor Jim," he said, cutting his steak with unnecessary force. 25 years of marriage down the drain because his wife became impossible during menopause. Some women just lose their minds completely. He looked directly at me. "Lucky for you, David. Sarah seems to be handling it better than most." The implication was clear. I was being evaluated, and my performance during menopause would determine my worth as a wife. David said nothing, just nodded and asked for more potatoes. I started noticing how Robert would monopolize David's time. Every weekend, there was some project at Robert's house that required David's help. Every week, there was some crisis that needed David's immediate attention. And David, dutiful son that he was, would drop everything and run to his father's aid. During these increasingly frequent absences, I began to feel like a ghost in my own home. I'd make dinner for 2, and David would text at the last minute saying his father needed him to stay for dinner because he was feeling lonely. I'd suggest we invite Robert to our house instead, but there was always some excuse. His back hurt, he preferred his own chair, he didn't want to be a burden. The real turning point came 6 weeks ago when I decided to surprise David at Robert's house with his favorite homemade lasagna. I had a key. I'd been given 1 years ago for emergencies. So I let myself in through the back door, planning to leave the dish in the kitchen with a sweet note. That's when I heard them talking in the living room. Robert's voice was clear and sharp. "I'm telling you, son, this is when marriages fall apart. When women hit this age, they become bitter, demanding, impossible to live with. Your mother went through the same thing." My blood ran cold. David's mother had died when he was 12. What did menopause have to do with anything? "I know, Dad, but Sarah's not like that," David replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Not yet," Robert said ominously, "but mark my words, it's coming. The mood swings, the complaints, the constant need for attention. And then they start making demands, wanting to travel, wanting to find themselves, wanting to change everything about the life you've built together." I stood frozen in that kitchen, lasagna growing cold in my hands as my father-in-law continued his character assassination. "You're still young enough to start over, David. 51 isn't too old to find someone who appreciates what you have to offer. Someone who won't spend the next 10 years making your life miserable while she goes through changes." The silence that followed felt eternal. Finally, David spoke, and his words shattered something inside me. "I've been thinking about that lately, actually. Sarah has been different, more argumentative, less interested in the things we used to enjoy together." "That's exactly what I'm talking about," Robert said triumphantly. "It only gets worse from here. Trust me, I know." I set the lasagna on the counter as quietly as possible and backed toward the door. But Robert's next words stopped me in my tracks. I should have listened to my own advice 30 years ago. Could have saved myself a lot of heartache. 30 years ago? But David's mother had been dead for 40 years. What was Robert talking about? That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while David slept peacefully beside me, completely unaware that I'd overheard their conversation. But more than the betrayal, more than the hurt, I felt something else stirring inside me. Curiosity. What had Robert meant about 30 years ago? What advice should he have taken? And what did any of this have to do with David's mother? I was about to find out that some family secrets are buried for very good reasons. The next few weeks turned me into someone I didn't recognize, a detective in my own life, gathering evidence of my husband's emotional affair with his father's opinions about my worth. I started paying attention to every conversation, every glance, every subtle shift in David's behavior. When he'd come home from his father's house, he'd look at me differently, like he was cataloging my flaws, waiting for signs of the menopausal madness Robert had warned him about. The cruel irony was that their expectations started creating the very problems they feared. When David would come home late without calling, I'd express frustration, and he'd exchange that knowing look with his father. See? She's becoming difficult. When I'd suggest we spend a weekend together instead of at Robert's house, David would sigh and say, "You're being unreasonable, Sarah. He's elderly and needs our help." But I was also becoming something else, methodical. Every day after work, I'd stop by the university archives where I had access to old newspaper databases, public records, and genealogy websites. If Robert had been married before David's mother, there would be a paper trail. What I found in those dusty digital records made my hands shake. Robert hadn't been married once. He'd been married 3 times. His first wife, Margaret, had divorced him in 1987 after 15 years of marriage. The divorce papers, which were public record, cited irreconcilable differences, but the custody arrangement told a different story. Margaret had been granted full custody of their daughter, David's half-sister, that he'd never known existed. His second wife was David's mother, Linda, who had indeed died when David was 12, but according to the death certificate, she'd died in a car accident while driving alone at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday night. The police report noted that she'd been staying at a motel for the previous 3 weeks. His third wife, Patricia, had divorced him in 1995. She'd been 34 when they married, 42 when she left. The divorce papers were more detailed, citing emotional abuse and abandonment during a difficult period in the plaintiff's life. I sat in my car outside the library, staring at these documents, feeling like I was looking at a blueprint for my own future. 3 wives. 3 women who had apparently become difficult and been discarded. That evening, David came home with flowers, grocery store roses that looked like an afterthought. "Dad thought you might be feeling neglected," he said, not even looking at me as he handed them over. "How thoughtful of him to think of me," I replied, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. "He really cares about you, Sarah, about us. He just wants our marriage to work." I arranged the roses in a vase, my movements deliberate and calm. And what does he think might prevent it from working? David shifted uncomfortably. He's been through a lot with relationships. He knows how hard marriage can be when people go through changes. Changes like menopause. Well, yes, it's a difficult time for couples. He's just trying to help us navigate it. I turned to face my husband fully. This man I'd loved for 23 years who was now parroting his father's misogynistic talking points like gospel truth. "David, do you want our marriage to work?" "Of course I do. But you have to admit, you've been different lately. More intense." Intense. I repeated the word like I was tasting something bitter. Is that what we're calling it when a woman has opinions? See? This is exactly what Dad was talking about. You're looking for fights where there aren't any. That night, I made a decision. I was going to find Margaret, Robert's first wife, and Patricia, his third. I was going to learn what had really happened to these women who had been deemed difficult and discarded. But first, I was going to attend Robert's 76th birthday party next weekend and watch him play the role of the devoted patriarch, surrounded by family who had no idea what kind of man they were celebrating. I was going to smile, serve cake, and listen to his stories about being a devoted husband and father. And then I was going to destroy him. The birthday party was exactly what I expected. Robert holding court in his living room surrounded by neighbors and distant relatives, regaling them with stories of his business success and devoted family life. David played the perfect son, and I played the perfect daughter-in-law, refilling drinks and serving his favorite chocolate cake. But I wasn't the same woman who had walked into this house 2 months ago. I was a woman with a plan and a manila folder hidden in my car, containing 3 decades of carefully documented lies. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Robert pulled David aside for one of their private conversations. I was clearing dishes in the kitchen when I heard Robert's voice drop to that familiar conspiratorial whisper. "How's Sarah been this week? Any more mood swings?" "Actually, she's been great," David replied, and I could hear the confusion in his voice. "Really calm, almost. I don't know, peaceful?" "Don't be fooled," Robert warned. "That's often how it starts. The calm before the storm. They get quiet while they're planning their next dramatic episode." I set down the plates and walked into the living room, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "Robert, I found something interesting while organizing some old papers," I said, pulling out a folder. "I thought you might want to see these." Robert's face went pale as I opened the folder and pulled out the first document, his divorce papers from Margaret. I was curious about David's family history, so I did some genealogy research. Imagine my surprise when I discovered that David has a half-sister named Jennifer who's been living in Portland this whole time. David's face went white. "What are you talking about?" I handed him Margaret's divorce papers. "Your father was married before he met your mother, for 15 years, and Margaret didn't die, David. She divorced him and took their daughter with her." Robert stood up abruptly, his hands shaking. "Sarah, you don't understand." "Oh, but I do understand," I continued, my voice growing stronger. "I understand that you've been married 3 times, and all 3 wives became difficult and had to be dealt with. Margaret divorced you when she was 42. Patricia divorced you when she was 42. And now you're trying to convince your son that I, at 52, am about to become the same problem." I pulled out Patricia's divorce papers and read aloud. "Emotional abuse and abandonment during a difficult period in the plaintiff's life." I looked up at Robert, whose face had gone from pale to gray. "What was Patricia's difficult period, Robert? Was it menopause by any chance?" David was staring at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. "Dad, is this true?" "I found Patricia," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade. "She lives in Seattle now, happily remarried for 20 years, and she told me some very interesting stories about how you handled her changes, how you told her she was becoming impossible, how you suggested she might be happier somewhere else, how you made her feel like she was losing her mind." Robert's voice was barely a whisper. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I also found Margaret," I continued, pulling out my phone. "She's 78 now, living in an assisted living facility in Portland. And she told me the most fascinating story about how you convinced her that her mood swings during perimenopause were making her an unfit mother. How you gaslit her into believing she was mentally unstable. How you made her choose between fighting for custody and protecting her daughter from a brutal court battle." David was staring at his father like he'd never seen him before. "Dad, is this true?" Robert's mask finally slipped completely. "Those women were impossible. They changed, David. They became bitter, demanding, ungrateful." "Like your mother was becoming before she died?" I interrupted, my voice now thunderous. "Because I also found the police report from her accident. She'd been living in a motel for 3 weeks, Robert. 3 weeks. What did you do to drive her away from her 12-year-old son?" The silence that followed was deafening. Robert collapsed back into his chair, and David stood frozen, holding the evidence of his father's pattern of destroying women who dared to age. "So here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice deadly calm. "You're going to call Jennifer tomorrow and apologize for 35 years of stolen family. You're going to stop poisoning my husband against me. And you're going to get therapy, or I'm going to make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of man you really are." The aftermath of that confrontation was like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion. Robert sat in his chair for a full 5 minutes without speaking, his face cycling through denial, anger, and finally, something that looked almost like relief. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were different, smaller somehow, like a man who had been caught in a lie he'd been telling for so long, he'd almost convinced himself it was true. "You don't understand," he said quietly, his voice stripped of its usual authority. "I loved them, all of them, but they changed. They became people I didn't recognize." David was still standing in the middle of the room, holding the divorce papers like they might burst into flames. "Dad, you told me my mother died in an accident. You never said she'd left us." "She did die in an accident," Robert said defensively. "But she'd been different for months before that. Angry all the time, crying for no reason, saying I didn't understand what she was going through. She said she needed space to figure things out." I felt a chill run down my spine. "So you let your 12-year-old son believe his mother abandoned him because she was having a mental breakdown, instead of telling him she was struggling and needed support?" "I was protecting him," Robert's voice cracked. "Do you know what it's like to watch someone you love become a stranger? To have them look at you like you're the enemy when all you want is for things to go back to the way they were?" For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt a flicker of something that might have been pity. This man had spent 40 years running from the same pattern, never recognizing that he was the common denominator in all these failed relationships. David finally found his voice. "What about Jennifer? I have a sister and you never told me." Robert's shoulders sagged. "Margaret made it clear that she didn't want me in their lives. She said I was toxic, that I'd poisoned Jennifer against her own mother the way I'd poisoned everyone else. She wasn't wrong." The admission hung in the air like smoke. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The confession, the acknowledgement of guilt. But instead of satisfaction, I felt something unexpected. Sadness for all the years we'd lost to this man's inability to face his own demons. "I called Jennifer yesterday," I said quietly. Both men looked at me in shock. "She's a nurse practitioner in Portland. Married, 2 kids in college. She's been wondering about her half-brother for 35 years. David's face crumpled. She knows about me. She's been hoping you'd find her someday. Margaret told her about you, about how much you meant to your mother. She has pictures, David. Pictures of you and your mother that Robert never showed you." Robert was crying now, silent tears that seemed to surprise him as much as they surprised us. "I threw them away," he whispered. "After Linda died, I threw away all her things. I couldn't look at them without remembering how angry she'd been, how disappointed in me." "She wasn't disappointed in you because of who you were?" I said, my voice gentler now. "She was disappointed because of who you wouldn't let her become." The truth was settling over all of us like dust after an explosion. Robert had spent 4 decades destroying relationships rather than examining his own fear of change, his own inability to love someone through their evolution instead of despite it. David set the papers down and walked over to his father. For a moment I thought he might embrace him, might offer forgiveness. Instead, he sat down across from him and said, "I need you to tell me everything. About Mom, about Margaret, about Patricia, all of it. And then," I added, "you're going to get help, real help, because this pattern ends now." Robert looked between us, and for the first time in the 23 years I'd known him, he looked truly vulnerable. "I don't know how to love someone who's changing," he admitted. "I don't know how to be enough for someone who's becoming more than they were when I met them." "Then you learn," David said firmly, "because I'm not losing my wife the way you lost everyone else." The plot twist I hadn't seen coming was this. Robert's cruelty hadn't just been about control or misogyny, though those were certainly part of it. It had been about terror, the terror of a man who had never learned that love isn't about keeping someone the same, but about growing alongside them as they change. And the confrontation I'd planned as revenge had become something else entirely, an intervention for a man who had been destroying his own life for 40 years, one relationship at a time. But the real surprise was yet to come, because 3 days later, my phone rang, and the voice on the other end said, "Sarah, this is Jennifer. I think it's time I met my brother." 6 months later, I'm sitting in my kitchen writing this story, and my life looks completely different than it did when Robert made that cruel comment about my menopause. But not in the way any of us expected. David and Jennifer met for the first time last month. She drove down from Portland with a shoebox full of photographs and stories about their mother that Robert had never shared. Watching my husband see pictures of himself as a toddler, with the mother he barely remembered, was one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking things I've ever witnessed. Jennifer looks exactly like David. Same eyes, same gentle smile, same way of tilting her head when she's thinking. She's everything Robert said she would be. Strong, independent, successful. Everything he was apparently terrified of in a woman. Robert is in therapy now. Real therapy. Twice a week with a counselor who specializes in attachment issues and generational trauma. It turns out that his own father had abandoned his mother during what would have been her menopause, and Robert had spent his entire adult life unconsciously repeating the pattern, while consciously trying to avoid it. The irony is devastating and perfect. He's also been writing letters to Margaret, to Patricia, to Jennifer, and surprisingly to me. Long, rambling letters where he tries to untangle 40 years of justifications and excuses and get to the truth underneath. Most of them he doesn't send, but his therapist says the process of writing them is helping him understand how his fear of abandonment had turned him into the very thing he was afraid of becoming. Someone who abandons others. Margaret passed away 2 months ago, peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by Jennifer and her grandchildren. Robert never got to apologize to her directly, but Jennifer says she'd forgiven him years ago. She said holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die, Jennifer told us. She just wanted to make sure I knew that his problems weren't my fault. Patricia, on the other hand, is very much alive and thriving. She agreed to meet with Robert once, with her current husband present and a therapist mediating. She told him exactly what his abandonment had cost her. Years of therapy, a complete loss of trust in her own perceptions, and a fear of aging that had taken decades to overcome. But she also told him that his cruelty had ultimately led her to the love of her life, a man who celebrated every year she aged and every way she grew. The best revenge, she told me over coffee when I visited Seattle, was becoming the woman he said I couldn't be. As for David and me, we're in couples therapy too, but not for the reasons you might think. We're learning how to be married to each other as the people we're becoming, not just the people we were when we met at 29. We're learning that a good marriage isn't about avoiding change, but about changing together. David has started standing up to his father in ways that surprise both of us. Last week, when Robert made a comment about my new haircut making me look younger, David shut it down immediately. Dad, Sarah looks beautiful, and more importantly, she's happy. That's all that matters to me. I did get that new haircut, by the way, and highlights, and I started taking salsa dancing lessons. And I'm considering going back to school for my master's degree in library science. Not because I'm having a midlife crisis, but because menopause has given me something unexpected, the freedom to stop caring what other people think about my choices. The woman Robert was so afraid I'd become confident, opinionated, unwilling to shrink myself to make others comfortable, turns out to be exactly who I was meant to be all along. Here's what I learned from this whole experience. The people who are threatened by your growth are usually the people who have stopped growing themselves. The people who love you will celebrate your evolution, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it means they have to evolve too. Menopause isn't a disease to be managed or a problem to be solved. It's a transition, like adolescence, like marriage, like any other major life change. And the people who can't handle you during your transitions probably don't deserve you during your stability. To anyone reading this who recognizes themselves in my story, you are not too much. You are not difficult. You are not a problem to be solved. You are a human being in the process of becoming, and that process doesn't stop at 25 or 35 or 50 or ever. And to anyone who has someone in their life going through menopause, this is not happening to you. This is happening to them. Your job is not to manage their symptoms or minimize their experience. Your job is to love them through it. The best part? Robert's comment that was meant to make me feel disposable ended up proving that I'm absolutely irreplaceable. Not because I'm perfect, but because I'm real. And real love grows alongside real people, wrinkles and hot flashes and all. What's your story? Have you ever discovered that the person trying to diminish you was actually afraid of your power? I'd love to hear from you in the comments.